Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this conversation with Nancy Ammerman, who is a giant in the field of the sociology of religion. She's Professor Emerita at Sociology of Religion at Boston University, and long, long ago was my professor when I was allowed into a PhD seminar as a master's student and had no idea what I'd signed up for. But we know what we signed up for in welcoming Nancy today in this conversation. So, Nancy, thank you so much for being with us.
Delighted to be here.
I'm joined by my colleague Amy Traver as well. Hello, Amy.
Hi, everybody.
Great to have you. So, Nancy, you have studied religion, religious communities from so many different angles. But one of the things that I'm really curious about is what drew you to the study of religion in the first place. Did you have a religious background? Why did you think about it sociologically rather than maybe theologically, or from a different perspective? What drew you to this work?
Well, I think I was sort of born to it because I was born to a Baptist minister, and in some sense grew up studying religion,
Mm,
and not just studying as in like studying the Bible or studying doctrine, but uh, when one is a preacher's kid and you move around, you go from one religious
mm,
community to another. You kind of have to learn to be an astute observer of the cultures of the congregations that you are joining. You have
mm,
to learn to figure out who's who and what's what and how they do things. And that sense of just being an insider but an outsider
mm.
is, I think, just a part of who I was coming along. And you know, being uh, being a sociologist and being an observer of congregations from a sociological point of view came very naturally to me.
Mm. I love that because you're kind of just being able to compare and contrast right
Oh
from the very
yeah.
beginning.
Yeah.
I remember one of the most important tools that I learned from you was kind of these four lenses of looking at congregations. Can you because and I think a lot of those lenses apply to spiritual communities of all sorts, not just
Oh,
kind of
absolutely.
traditional religious congregations.
Yeah.
Can you introduce us to those four lenses and why were they important for the
Yeah.
work that you did as a scholar?
Well, one of them is the one I was just speaking of, which is the culture lens. Sort of pretend you're an anthropologist, understand that every group of people, once they get to be a group of people, will establish patterns,
Mm,
ways of being together, and they'll make things, they'll make artifacts, they'll have patterns of things that they regularly do together that they say to each other, well, this is just the way we do things.
mm,
Um, so uh, that way of just thinking about a group of people as having a culture that shapes them in the same way that any culture shapes the people who are part of that culture.
mm,
Uh, One of the other lenses is what we call the ecology lens. So here you're thinking like a biologist, if you will,
mm,
thinking about this organism, this group of people, this community, and how that community is situated in this larger context that feeds it, that
mm,
it in turn has an impact on. The way any organism in the environment requires the environment to be a nurturing one, to be one that's not going to attack it,
mm.
and also that just by being in that environment, it's going to have an effect back out on the environment. Well, that's the case with any religious community as well. It needs nutrients, it needs people, it needs resources, all of those things that keep it alive.
Mm.
Uh, okay, what are the process for it?
If I may,
Huh.
just to make it Nancy, to kind of make it real. So the difference between culture and ecology, for example, the cultural pattern that you might notice is, if there's conflict in the community, we don't talk about it, or this is how we're going to fight about it. And the ecology piece, rather than just seeing a conflict as being about what's, personal disagreements in the community, you might think about, well, let's look at the news and think about how this community is part of a broader kind of landscape. Am I understanding that correctly? That there's a bigger context to conflict that might be happening in a community?
Absolutely. And one of the other contexts of that conflict might be that the ecology is draining it of resources in some way, draining it of people, generationally, or people moving, or industry going away. In a community, and so the population's shrinking. So it's draining those resources, and people are fighting among themselves over the fact that they're shrinking, and they don't recognize that that's what they're fighting about.
Right.
It's something that's out there that's bigger. And speaking of fighting, the process frame really does focus in on the questions, particularly of power, of how we do things here, but it's particularly how we do things relative to who gets to decide, how we decide. Those, if you're a social group of any kind, you're going to develop leadership, hierarchies, rules. Literal rules sometimes, but often unspoken rules. Okay, so Casper, help me out.
Leadership, I think, is the last one.
Leadership, yes. And resources, we do identify as a specific kind of frame that you can look at any kind of religious community and ask, how is it generating resources and how is it using resources? But leadership is about how you think about who's in charge, how you think about it. Is it, one person, or is it the whole community somehow working democratically? So there's that. But, I think since you were in that class, we added a frame.
Aha!
And that frame was theology frame.
Interesting.
Yeah, as a specific, it's not just an extension of culture, which is kind of the way I, as a sociologist, tend to think about theology as part of the culture of the congregation. But, theology has its own power, and deserves being addressed as its own way of thinking about, how does this group's understanding of the divine shape who they are.
Very cool. You're making me think about, and this is a little bit of an insider baseball note maybe, but in the United States, a lot of Christian communities, institutions, certainly Christian kind of public life is funded by one major funder, by the Lilly Endowment. And for many decades, their strategy has been around congregational excellence. Congregations are the heart of Christianity in the US. And so we, as the Lilly Endowment, want to support congregational excellence. And each of those lenses gives you an avenue in to think about how to support congregational life. And at the same time, I think what I really appreciate about that ecological view of looking beyond individual congregations to the broader kind of moment that we're in is that, well, one of the reasons congregations are struggling is not because of bad leadership or, internal conflict, or even, theology of conservative or liberal flavors. But there's just bigger changes happening in society that is about technology, about the economy, about all sorts of other things that you can't just solve solve at that congregational level. So I guess what I'm saying is what I've liked so much about how you think about religion is that you've always thought not just about these kind of official centers of where religion might be happening and supporting kind of congregational excellence, but really looking at a much bigger frame. So I'm curious, as you grew in your scholarship over time, how did your kind of young sociologist brain start to look not just at the places that you went as a preacher's kid, but looking at religion in society generally? Where did you start to see it happening, as it were?
Well, I think there have probably been two primary important movements. The first was simply to recognize a much bigger religious world that is, in terms of just organized religion, even because growing up, I grew up in a very narrow little slice of American Christianity, conservative Christianity at that, and discovering that there are these really interesting like Catholics and Unitarians and Jews and whatever. That in itself was an important sort of opening for me to be fascinated with all of the different traditions and ways in which people have been gathering, but then also with people like you becoming fascinated with the fact that people are gathering around all sorts of spiritual traditions and experimenting with ways in which to encounter the sacred. And that's happening both in gatherings in organized sorts of ways, more and less formally organized, but it's also happening in people's everyday lives. And one of the things that was a major kind of turning point for me was, ironically, encountering sociological ways of thinking that predicted that religion would disappear, predicting that the modern world would be secular and that people would simply not want to or be able to believe in anything or encounter anything spiritual. Everything would be explainable and in scientific secular terms. And looking around the world and thinking, you know, there's just an awful lot out there that doesn't fit this model. And it's not just, poor, backward, uneducated people that don't fit this model. And so how do we think about what it is people are doing and experiencing that doesn't look like the organized stuff that we've always, counted up members and, that was our measure of whether religion was around or not. How do we think about this everyday life kind of spirituality?
That idea of lived religion, kind of the academic language of that, in some ways is very exciting, but also is much more difficult to study because you're not going into a building, and just watching people as they do the regular worship service. So how did you study, these people, these kind of sometimes called spiritual but not religious, or the unaffiliated, or even just religious behaviors that didn't fit the traditional maybe lanes of what we would think of as religion?
Yeah. Well, my first attempt at doing that was to ask people to tell stories. Because my hunch was that if you ask people to talk about what was going on in their everyday lives, to talk about their work, to talk about their families, to talk about where they live, their homes, that you would hear the spiritual stories coming out, the spiritual aspect of those stories would be apparent. And sometimes that spiritual aspect was a direct reference to, being a part of a particular faith community.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Sometimes it was, reference to a particular belief that would be recognized as a kind of traditional religious belief, but it often was more amorphous.
Mm,
But had a clear reference to there's something beyond me.
mm,
There's something that I perhaps can't explain, but I nevertheless know is there.
mm,
And that I value, that I perhaps have a little shrine in my living room for,
mm,
or, a little symbol on my desk that
mm,
reminds me, or, a story that shaped my life.
mm,
Uh, all of those things cropped up. They weren't
mm.
everywhere. It wasn't like an either or situation where people's lives were either secular or sacred.
Yeah.
They were all intertwined and mixed up.
Yeah. Those
Yeah,
boundaries are so they can seem so clear in our mind, but they're so much messier in terms of people's
yeah,
actual lived experience.
yeah.
How would you then tell, Nancy, the story? You laid out that kind of classic secularization thesis, right? The idea that as economies develop and societies become more modern, we see a decline in religion. How would you tell a different story of what you found in your research as time passes?
I would say that there's still an important element in that story of
Mm,
the degree to which aspects of what we think of as the modern world do make it more difficult for certain kinds of religious behaviors or traditions to survive in certain ways. But uh, what I would also say is that I think it has reminded, I would tell a story that is less about belief,
mm,
more about belonging.
mm,
Uh, that for people, and actually in much of the world, it's not about being able to articulate a set of doctrines or
mm,
ideas.
mm.
That's not what they're most concerned about.
Yeah.
What they're concerned about is experience, a
Mm,
sense of encountering, uh,
mm,
feeling, if you will, and a presence,
mm,
a guiding hand sometimes, but also
mm,
simply a, uh, a sense of being a part of something larger than oneself.
mm.
And that if as a sociologist, what I need to pay attention to is what are the times and places where that's more and less likely.
Yeah.
It's not like the whole world makes it unlikely, but there are some times and places that make it very unlikely that
Yeah.
you're going to experience that sense of sacredness. And there are other times and places that make it very likely.
So what made it very likely? What did you? Oh, sorry, Amy.
That's okay.
You go after this one.
Okay.
Oh, well, obviously, religious communities themselves organize themselves
Yeah.
to make it likely, to invite people into moments when it is possible and likely to experience that sense of transcendence or the sacred. Um, People themselves will develop
Mm,
practices that make it possible for them to routinely experience transcendence. People had all sorts of ways of talking about why, where, and why. Uh, Nature's big. Uh,
mhm,
you know, people uh, get into a forest or a seaside or a mountaintop, and And those experiences of nature, awe is one of the things that we identified in these stories as part of what people are experiencing, is that experience of awe. There's also the experience of connecting with people, being part of a community, either a small one, an intimate community, but also being part of something very large and overwhelming. So those are a few of the things.
Awesome. Amy.
Thank you. I'm struck by a couple of things in what you've said. One is maybe the role of consumer culture, particularly in the creation of the rituals or the symbolic representations in the household. So the house being a space, and then the marketplace obviously feeding into that. And then also, I love the attention that you give to conversation in your work, and this idea that we're kind of constructing religious understanding and community and each other as religious beings as we are in dialogue. So I wondered if you are struck by either of those comments.
Oh, that's two big comments. And you're absolutely right that people don't themselves make everything that they use as part of their practice. So there is always going to be a market for things that people will find to be meaningful. That's obviously a mixed blessing. It can be very distorting, but it also one of the stories that I draw from other people's work, and I would just say that the next step in my own imagination has been drawing on a much larger body of people's research on other parts of the world and other religious traditions, spiritual traditions. One of the stories that I really love is about the people who make various religious objects for whom that making of a religious object is a practice. Making an icon, weaving flowers, all sorts of things that people make that then perhaps they sell. So money enters into it, but that making of things and exchanging of things, I think, is a piece of that whole picture of how it is people practice and create spaces and places and experiences of the sacred. Conversation, of course, it's another thing we produce. Together we make a conversation, and together that conversation makes us. One of the things that I learned from my sociological teachers and theories is that we are constantly having experiences and using words and conversations to explain those experiences. And once we have encountered another person and told stories to each other, we're never the same again. It may not seem like we've, it had some sort of revolutionary change in our lives, but that has simply become a building block. That it's a memory. It's a part of who we will be in the future.
Those two themes of kind of making culture and conversation remind me of a project in Canada. I think it was the Yukon First Nations had this kind of youth climate fellowship, essentially a program for young people with Indigenous heritage to, research and understand how climate change is affecting their ancestral homelands. But what was so interesting reading their description of their process, and I'll make sure we link to this in the description for this video, it's really beautiful to hear the young people narrate their own experience of their own spirituality through things like beading, through
Mm,
things like making a collective narrative artistically,
mm,
and through just the conversations of recontextualizing their own authenticity, really their own authentic spirituality through both this kind of making culture and conversation. So I love that you're
yeah,
you're pointing to both those things.
yeah, yeah.
We touched on kind of methodologically that you started with people's stories. And one of the ways that I remember you did that was by asking people to photograph things that were
Mhm.
meaningful to them. And I'm thinking, for folks who are leading a community or thinking about cultivating the spiritual life of the people they gather, I'm curious what surprised you about that methodology. Did you think it would work? Like what did you learn? Because you're
You
kind of
know,
giving people permission to photograph a lamp, a flower. Like what came out of that methodology?
you know, uh, I I actually learned about the methodology from medical people who
Interesting.
had uh, who were doing this as a way to to help people figure out what it was in their everyday lives that was getting in the way of their health. Uh,
Wow.
uh,
Huh.
and yeah, I thought, well, that could be interesting. I don't know. Let's give it a try. And do you remember Roman Williams?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Roman was working with us on this spiritual narratives project, and he just sort of took that and ran. And he's now he has created something called interfaith photo voice.
Cool.
He's picked up on something called photo voice as a technique. And the idea is that, again, you give people cameras themselves and have them photograph, important things, or you can give them a theme or whatever. Uh, Often he uses it with groups across faith differences.
Ah, interesting.
Uh, but have people photograph things and then they work together in small groups to share
Mm,
their photos
mm,
and then often curate and exhibit
mm,
to show so that the whole larger community can see what they saw as they were exploring this aspect of who they are as a community or who they are as people. Uh, but yeah, what have I learned? That it is a great way into people's everyday lives.
mm,
And
mm,
it it really does reveal the degree to which spaces are really, we define spaces
mm,
as um, as either mundane, ordinary places that we never think about, but often define the spaces in our lives and give them meaning. Um,
mm,
they become places that uh, we want to protect,
mm,
that we want to tell people about.
mm.
Um, uh, just come to my
Amy,
house. I'll show you my garden.
I was gonna say, well, one of my questions was, did you find that in asking people to notice a name by taking a photo or by narrating it to you, that it actually changed the status of how they thought about it in the first place? Because I feel like something like a garden or something like a musical instrument, people might feel an affection for or a dedication to, but they might not use religious or spiritual language for it. But then you come in and say, "Hey, what's spiritual?" And they're like, "Well, actually, my
Yeah.
garden is kind of a spiritual place for me." Like, yeah, talk to me about that.
Well, an interviewing process is always tricky
Mm,
because in some ways, like, we were just talking about conversation. Uh,
yeah.
the conversation itself brings out new meanings, always,
Mm, mm,
whether it's an official interview or anything else.
mm,
Uh, but in this particular project, good researchers that we were, we tried not to define what
huh,
spirituality was for
huh,
people. whenever they'd say, well, what do you mean by spirituality? We'd say, well, what do you mean? And we tended not to lead with questions like, what's spiritual for you about X, Y, or Z? We would
Mm,
simply say, tell me about, and listen for
mm,
the spiritual as it came out more naturally. But you're absolutely right that in that process, people often articulated a kind of connection that they might not have thought about or articulated in quite that way before. And one of the things that's amazing about interviewing people about their spiritual and religious lives is that they often say at the end of the interview, wow,
yeah.
nobody's ever asked me
Ask
about
me
those
that.
things before.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's been so good to talk about whatever.
Mm,
And I often leave that interview and think, where the hell was their church? That they didn't, that
yeah.
they hadn't given them a chance to talk about these things. They need a community
Yeah.
that is willing to ask the spiritual
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. Amy.
I have a desire and an instinct to start pulling things off my shelf and showing them to you so that
Mhm.
we can kind of talk
Good.
about them. Because even the spiritual things that I have over here, like they might not, you might read them in that way, but my reading of them is not in spiritual terms. So I think it kind
Mhm.
of goes
Mhm.
both ways, this
Yeah,
interpretive work.
absolutely.
But but the last point you made, I think is such a strong transition to your work on kind of spiritual tribes and this
Mhm.
idea that we, if religion is often emerging through conversation, we have to discover and connect with people who will do that with us, who will do that work with us. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? I think that's probably directly relevant to a lot of the work that the innovators are doing.
Absolutely, it is. You know, I was really ambivalent about using the word tribe.
Mm,
It's a, it can be an unfortunate word. But what I was trying to capture is simply that we need communities.
mm,
We need places uh, that we recognize, where they recognize us and we recognize them, and trust them enough to have these kinds of conversations.
mm,
Um, but the unfortunate part of thinking about tribes is that often the people who gather around this kind of spiritual quest or conversation are very much like each other. Uh, and they're tribes in multiple senses. And part of what we really need in the larger context is the
yeah.
ability to gather where we are encountering difference as well
Yeah.
as sameness. Um, but the larger point is that people don't necessarily cultivate a spiritual aspect of their lives unless they have a community with
Mm,
whom they're doing that work. Uh,
mm,
One of the things that came out of that larger study was simply that the people who were most adamant about saying that they were spiritual but not religious, for the most part, really didn't have either a regular practice
yeah.
or a community. And they didn't have spirituality simply didn't show up very much
Mm,
in their their way of thinking about themselves or talking about themselves.
mm,
The spirituality that they were trying to claim was pretty thin.
mm,
And it was the people who had a regular community of whatever kind
yeah.
who also were likely to have a fairly regular set of practices of some sort and to have a keener sense of what was present in their lives.
Would it be fair to say, Nancy, that really we're finding there a difference between maybe the aspiration people have or the story they have of themselves versus the reality? And the difference was that the more connected you were to a community or some communal group, even if it's not an official community, that's when those kind of spiritual practices and maybe even values had a chance to be actually lived. So
Yeah.
you need a community for those values and practices to be real.
Yeah, I think one of the other things we discovered is that the the notion of being spiritual but not religious is in some ways more of an identity than it is a
Yeah,
reality.
yeah,
It's a way for people to describe themselves that uh, resists being put in a secular box, but also resists being put in a religious box. And in some ways, that means it doesn't necessarily have a lot of content.
yeah. That makes sense.
So, Nancy, I'm thinking about these last comments in light of our earlier conversation about congregations
Mhm.
and this idea of producing religion and spirituality in dialogue and communication and interaction, and then the interaction between the congregation and the context. And I'm thinking about the work that you've done creating like a typology of how congregations respond to contextual changes
Mhm.
and sort of the limitations of some of the models, right? A real resistance in some cases to changing with the changing context. And so I think we can think about this on an interpersonal level, but also I think it relates to your earlier work on the institutions too.
Yeah. Yeah, you're taking me back to quite a while ago work. Uh, Congregations in the US, uh, many of them are actually, quite well established and old. Uh, they've got buildings, they've got histories. Uh, they've got a place in the community, a sense of where they belong in the community, and that's hard to change.
Mm,
Uh, and those buildings, especially, are really hard to figure out what to do with. But more than that, cultures are hard to change once you have a comfortable way of doing things. You know, somebody comes along and says, "No, no, that doesn't work anymore." Uh, so figuring out that kind of both internal change and change in institutions and resources and place in the environment, that's really hard work. And what we discovered in looking at congregations as part of a sort of larger ecology of congregations and organizations in a community is that when a community changes, what's more likely to happen is that some of the old institutions die and new ones come along.
mm,
It's a process of replacement more than it is a process of individual organizations in that ecology of organizations changing along with the larger landscape. And that's not to say there aren't some that do, uh, but the ones that manage to do that kind of really hard, both internal and external facing work are really a small number of the overall group of congregations that just kind of exist out there. One really interesting fact about congregations in the US is that there are, in any given 5 or 10 year period, as many new congregations
mm,
that get founded as go away.
mm.
So there's kind of an equilibrium that seems to be there. Uh, so you have so many new congregations coming along that, they're meeting in some storefront or they're meeting in a condo activities room or whatever. And sometimes they're quite invisible for a while.
Mm.
They only appear when there's the sign on the sidewalk on Sunday morning or Saturday morning. Yeah, and then eventually, perhaps, they decide, well, maybe we should build a building. Woohoo!
Then the
and
problems
appear
start.
on
Yeah.
more than Sunday morning or Saturday morning.
How, Nancy, how do you square that circle with the fact that, for the first time in recorded history, fewer than half the American population is now a member of a congregation? Is it that the size of the average congregation is declining, or
Yes.
okay, yeah,
Actually, it's bifurcating.
mm,
More people proportionately are in really big congregations, but the average congregation is smaller and smaller.
yeah,
So the sort of the median size for a congregation is something like, I don't know, 55 people on Sunday morning.
yeah, that's
No, it's
different.
pretty small.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question that is very unfair, Nancy, because this is now going way beyond your authority as a sociologist, but really drawing on your decades of being able to look at these patterns over time. And I want you to take out a crystal ball and imagine, based on what you have seen over these years, how is, and maybe we can limit it to American religion, just because that's been the focus of your research. What's going to happen? What do you think will come next?
Well, I do have a lot of faith in the ingenuity of American religious people, or
Mm,
American people being religious and thinking, the American voluntary system is so ingenious. Everybody thinks they can start a religious community, and there's nobody out there saying, oh, no, 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 no. You have to get permission from whoever to do this. So, I think I do see a continuing kind of bubbling up of creativity of all sorts. But I think the thing that, as a person of faith who cares about religious communities, the thing I worry about
mm,
is that uh, we do have increasingly people are growing up without any attachment
mm,
and without any regular practice of being a part of any kind of spiritual or religious community.
mm,
And we simply know that, what happens in your growing up has a huge impact on what happens in the rest of your life. So that the proportion of people who are, young adults who've had no religious upbringing is increasing over time, and they're replacing us oldsters who grew up with religious upbringing.
mm,
Uh, and that's hard to overcome, I think. It's really hard to say to somebody who's never had
yeah,
any tradition of being a part of a religious or spiritual community, uh, try it out, you know, e- especially if it looks like or threatens to look like it might be one of those right-wing crazy religious places. And, that's the
right.
other thing that's really driving the disaffiliation is the way in the US, especially, being Christian and being crazy white, crazy white nationalist
Mm,
have been fused in people's minds. The
yeah,
visible people who claim that term, Christian,
mm,
uh, are people that the very people who haven't had that religious upbringing, want absolutely nothing to do with.
right,
Uh,
right.
So there's some really formidable barriers in the ecology,
Yeah.
in the generational ecology and in the political ecology. Uh, and, I see both spiritual innovators and progressive religious leaders in traditional religious communities trying to be much more visible
Mm.
and working hard at uh, creating resources for people and being visible in the places where people show up, i.e.,
Mm.
online,
Mm.
uh, but also, just in the Sunday brunch places or the Friday night pub places or whatever. Um, so I think there is that innovative spirit that does have the capacity to
Mm.
meet the moment, but it's a
Mm.
really formidable moment.
Mm. I can't remember if it was you who talked to me about this book. I'm sure it was. Religion as a Chain of Memory. Is that the title?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think about that so often because I feel like in some ways, my own experience, I didn't grow up going to church. I didn't have, certainly didn't grow up with the Bible or God talk. There were other beautiful things I grew up with, but not so much that. And I felt like going to divinity school in a way was trying to kind of link a
Mhm.
chain, culturally, and for me that was in a Christian context, to try and relearn a language or to reconnect to a sort of a chain through time, through which my life gained new meaning. And I think that's what I'm picking up in what you're saying so much, is that without the community in which we get to have conversation, but also without that kind of gift from generation to generation, we lose much of the resources that we have to make meaning. And if that's one of the primary tools of what religious practice, religious community helps us do, um, passing on something is even if it's not perfect, is better than having to start all over again. Is that a fair assessment? Would you say?
I think that's a very fair assessment. I mean, starting from scratch in
It's
trying
real
to
tough.
invent a spiritual language,
Yeah.
uh, trying to invent rituals, trying to invent, symbols that will capture
Mm,
something that points you beyond yourself and towards something that is
mm,
guiding and good in the world.
mm.
That, that's also a formidable task.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for your time today. As ever, my brain is stimulated, my heart is engaged. I'm so grateful for this conversation, but also all of your support in our work here at Sacred Design Lab throughout the years. So, thank
Well,
you.
you two are doing such important work, and I am so delighted whenever I have a conversation with you at the way you're able to be one of those creative, innovative
Mm,
people who's both helping to invent language, but also invent conversation spaces. So
mm.
thank you.
Thanks, Nancy.